Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody around the world. We hope that you're having a good time enjoying Microsoft Build 2020, the virtual edition. Some friends of mine today are going to answer some questions. You can do an Ask the Team for Visual Studio. We're going to hang around for the next hour. The way that this is going to work is that you're going to have a chance to kind of just chit chat with us. We're going to have a running set of questions and answers, so feel free to start submitting those now. And then we'll give you some places to go and interact with us beyond this if you'd like to. So if this is the first time you're doing a session like this, there's a few things that you need to know. There is a chat box where you can go to ask questions. You have the choice of either putting in your name. If you do, we may say that live on air, or you can post anonymously, and that's fine. All questions are moderated, so us as well as other moderators are making sure that questions are appropriate and will be approved. If they are, once they are approved, others will be able to upvote them, and we will we'll cherry pick across both most favorited questions and some kind of hot, fresh new questions. So if you really like a question, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Me and my buddies will all be answering these questions verbally, so you'll be able to hear and follow along. So we won't necessarily be replying by text, although in some cases we will maybe provide additional information via the chat. And then a little bit of etiquette. Like I mentioned, this session will be recorded, and we will use it internally. For yourself, please don't record this session. We'll make it available to see it later. And then, yeah, just try to ask great questions. Don't spam the chat. You know, we have a lot of people on the line already and a lot of questions that have already come in. So do everything that you can to help make this efficient, please. Also, you must adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. I'm sure you've seen this if you've been in any other sessions, but here is that code of conduct for your reference. So without further ado, a quick round of introductions. The guy with the silly picture and the orange Muppet, that's me. I'm Nick Molnar. I'm a principal program manager on the Visual Studio Services team, where I focus on the Visual Studio Code Spaces service. And we'll go around the horn. Let's start with Anthony. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Anthony Cangelosi. I'm a program manager also on the Visual Studio team. Been on Visual Studio for quite a long time, probably, well, I guess my entire career. I've been super excited to work on a bunch of different projects, everything from mobile development back when it is, well, the first time it was called Windows Mobile, and the second time, as well as worked on a number of platform features today. I get the pleasure of getting to work with a lot of talented PMs on everything from Git tooling to the new Visual Studio Code Spaces integration, and a number of other features in VS. Thank you.
Jonathan?
You're muted, Jonathan.
Hi, I don't know how to use Teams.
No, so that's 1 point on virtual conference bingo for you.
Yep. All right, I'm gonna have to answer good questions to redeem myself there. So yeah, my name is Jonathan Carter. I'm also a PM on the VS team. Have been at Microsoft for about 13 years. And have worked on everything from ASP.NET to SQL Server to Windows tooling. And now I have the pleasure of working on Code Spaces, LiveShare, and IntelliCode. So looking forward to chatting with folks about those topics.
And last but not least, Andy.
Thanks. So yeah, I work on Visual Studio currently, the diagnostic tools mostly, so things to like debug, profile your application. Prior to that, I've worked on mostly browser tooling. Way back in the day on IE, and then just before that on something long gone and dead called Popfly, which is a great amount of fun, but developer tools are definitely a passion of mine. So I'm really excited to be here and hopefully answer some questions.
Awesome, thanks guys. I'll also point out that on the screen here are all of our Twitter handles. So if we don't get to answer your question in the next 55 or so minutes, feel free to engage with any of us on Twitter. And so what are we going to be talking about today? Anything that is developer related, Visual Studio Code, Code Spaces, LiveShare. Andy is British if you couldn't tell, so we'll talk about the British Bake Off. I live in Texas, so we can talk about barbecue, outdoor turkey fry, whatever you feel like makes sense. If it makes it past our moderators, we can have some fun. So without further ado, let's dive into some questions. Let's see here, I'll pick one off. This seems like a fun one to get started with. Maybe Anthony or Andy. What do you wish more people knew about Visual Studio? Who's going to take that?
I think it's always a good time to show a tip or a trick here when you get one of these questions. I personally like to show off under the window menu. We've had for a couple of releases now a feature called Save and Apply Window Layouts. It lets you actually take a snapshot of how you have all of the windows oriented inside of your IDE. So if you like your Solution Explorer on the right and your Git window right below it, Test Explorer on the left, you can save that layout to a setting that is actually roamed across all your devices. So with that, then you can have, say, for example, a profile that's set up for a mobile development versus a diagnostics profile. You can set one up that's more tuned for a condensed environment when you might be on a laptop screen, or something that better takes advantage of a full screen, and apply those as you're working and switch between them with just a single click and a shortcut.
Cool. The only thing I'd add is something I'm sure a lot of people aware of, but perhaps not everyone, is just the search control Q. Like, I personally find it so much easier typing and searching for everything from options, like tools options especially, rather than navigating the menus, just typing. It's there and it's awesome. Control Q.
Awesome. The next question that we'll look at is from Francois. He or she tried to build a couple of Visual Studio extensions and found the learning curve to be a little steep. Are there any plans to make Visual Studio extensions any easier or simpler to develop?
Yeah, I think I'll take that one, Nick. Yeah, our extension model has grown up with Visual Studio over the last 20 years, and it's gotten quite mature over that time. As we've gone through several technologies, and yeah, we've certainly heard that feedback that today, where we are today, is not what folks expect from a modern extensibility API. The good news is that the move that we're doing from local development into supporting code spaces has given us a chance to take a fresh look at Visual Studio's extensibility. So what we've had to do in the process is really separate out all of the compute from Visual Studio and the front end to make it a more modular application. And in the process of doing that, we're also taking a fresh look at our extensibility model as well. A few of our goals is we want to make it much simpler and easier for people to consume and write extensions for Visual Studio. We want them to be able to follow kind of modern development patterns. Also, some folks have asked about VS Code extensions and how easy people have found it is to write those extensions. That's another question we're looking at today as well, about how we can make it easy to write extensions that both work for Visual Studio Code as well as write for Visual Studio without having to relearn two different models at the same time. So while we don't have any new developments that we can share today, it's something that we're currently working on, and in the coming milestones, you should expect to see more from us about kind of where we're taking that extensibility model.
Awesome. Let's go to Jonathan next. Jonathan, Jeff would like to know if he can remove the live share button from the Visual Studio toolbar. It says that it takes up more space than what he has. Jonathan, that's 2 points for your speaker bingo.
My God. Okay. I guess in all fairness, I've been up all night. So that said, yes, mute fail twice. So the live share extension is installed by default with Visual Studio 2019, but you actually can uninstall it. And so while there is not an easy gesture to maybe right-click the live share button in the toolbar to remove it from there, if you went to the extensions tool window and looked for the live share extension, you would be able to uninstall it if you wanted. That said, if you want to use live share, you just don't want that button showing up in the toolbar. We don't currently have a way to hide that, and so I will take that as good feedback for us to consider. So thank you.
Awesome, Andy. Anonymous, not an anonymous person, the anonymous hacking ring wants to know, are there any plans to bring the snapshot debugger to Visual Studio Professional or Community?
So sorry, just laughing about the comment about anonymous. So yeah, so the snapshot debugger, for people not familiar to it, is all about enabling you to debug live services in Azure, so production services that are running without taking them offline. So normally if you're debugging something, you stop it to hit a breakpoint and you inspect stuff and everything pauses, which would be pretty terrible for a live site. And so snapshot debugger solves that problem, and it also works across multiple machines at the same time. So rather than just debugging one instance of your app, you can debug as many deployed. So right now, it's a fairly, how should I say, advanced feature. And while we always take on feedback about reevaluating which features in which SKU of Visual Studio, be it Community Pro or Enterprise, at the moment, there's no plans to move it down level. But do feel free to reach out to me on Twitter and have a conversation about it and why it would be super important to you to bring it down to Pro and Community and what the scenario is. So short answer is no. Long answer was talk to me.
Cool. I'll go ahead and I guess if I'm moderating, I get to pick which questions I'm going to answer. So I'm going to answer this question from Florence asking, will dev containers be supported inside of Visual Studio like they are inside of VS Code? Florence, this is actually work that our team has begun looking at and trying to figure out what does it make sense to bring over from dev containers in VS Code and apply them to Visual Studio. So the dev container support today is very much focused around Linux, and so where it makes sense, we'll look to bring those properties over, and where it doesn't, we'll look to figure out what is the proper alternative. So for example, today's dev container has settings that get applied for VS Code. Those settings may or may not apply the same to VS IDE. So the answer is effectively yes, but it's going to take some time, and we'd love feedback on that. So if there's a particular part of dev container or feature that you'd like to see running in VS IDE, please do reach out. You can hit us up on our GitHub repo where we take all of our feedback for code spaces. You'll find that in our documentation.
Nick, I think it's probably a good time to also recommend folks who want to try out and see what we have available for dev container supported in Visual Studio, that they try out the private preview of code spaces. So Visual Studio 2019 just released a private preview for code spaces, or refreshed it anyway, with new support for .NET Core development, ASP.NET Core, C++, and CMake projects, all projects that you can work on in Visual Studio, the IDE, but built in, running inside of a code space. And with that, there is some early support for code spaces that's there today, mostly about configuring the space itself, the code space. But as Nick mentioned, it's something that while we're in the private preview, we'll be sharing what we'll be thinking around how we will integrate code spaces into configuring a code space and configuring Visual Studio to work in a code space while you use Visual Studio, because we very much want to be able to realize a lot of the same value and benefits you get from that when you have that in your repository. And I'll just throw a link into the Q&A for folks to be able to see where they can go and sign up for the code spaces and Visual Studio 2019 private preview.
And I was actually going to throw the next question to you anyway, Anthony, and you kind of preempted it. That was Francois Rivard's question about using code spaces with Visual Studio as opposed to Visual Studio Code. He was also specifically asking about Visual Studio for C++. Can you just kind of add to your comment there about that?
Sorry, did you say the question was, is there support for C++ in code spaces?
Yes, in Visual Studio.
So, yes, so last November, we released support for CMake projects to be able to build and run those applications inside of a code space. As of today, the private preview now also includes support for VCX projects, or C++ projects based on VCX projects, the new modern C++ project system. Specifically, we have the ability to run and debug console and library-based applications. So a lot of the middleware applications that many C++ developers build today, you can build inside of a code space. That's what's supported today. We're looking at other supported technologies in the future as we start to look at whether or not different kinds of workloads that are very popular, like game development, UI framework development that's popular in C++. We're looking at that. So it's a great time to join the preview and give us feedback about the scenarios you'd like. But today you can do console and library apps using VCX Proj and the CMake project system for cross-platform app development.
Awesome. Larry wants to know if it would ever be appropriate to fry turkey anywhere but outdoors. I guess as the southerner of the group, Larry, No, that's just a bomb waiting to go off. Do not fry a turkey outdoors. A part of a turkey, fry that indoor. Chicken fried, turkey breast, doesn't sound as good as steak, but hey, who am I to judge? Go for that. Try that indoors. The whole thing, make sure it's outdoors in a well-ventilated area, away from any dry grass.
Now, Nick, do you think that the countertop deep fryers that are available for your kitchen make just as good of a deep fried turkey as the outdoor boilers that you can get?
I mean, I don't know what kind of large mart you're shopping at, Anthony. I've never seen a countertop one that could fit an entire turkey. But if you're just doing a turkey wing or something like that, yeah, you could get away with that just fine. Anonymous asks, and this is open for anybody in the group, is there any tutorials about creating VS Code extensions that we'd recommend?
VS Code extensions?
VS or VS Code extensions.
Yeah, on the Visual Studio Code side, the Visual Studio, if you go to code.visualstudio.com, they actually have pretty good tutorials for getting started with extensibility. So I would say, for that, I would definitely just recommend the kind of official documentation. And then if folks have questions that are remaining that those docs don't kind of help answer, it would be great to have that feedback.
Yeah, the same is true. While we had the conversation a little earlier about the maturity of the Visual Studio extensibility model, there's a ton of samples and a ton of docs that we've accumulated inside of docs.microsoft.com, as well as the SDK has starter templates to get you started, to kick you off with a project that includes everything from the V6 packaging as well as a basic package component that's the basic extensibility for VS, and samples for creating tool windows, editor extensions, and a number of other types of extension points in the IDE.
Awesome. Andy, you've been getting kind of sad and quiet over there, so I've got a question for you. I know you're just dreaming about deep fried
I like
turkey.
my dark corner here in my basement.
I love it, man. You're keeping it real. Tyrell is asking, are there any plans to bring code coverage to Visual Studio Professional?
To professional. This is a tricky one. So code coverage for C++ or for C#. So I'm not the best person to answer this, to be honest. Like, my team works on some of the back-end features that do some of the instrumentation, both for the C# and C++. But the UI features and the SKU choices are really with a different team, to be honest. So I'm not the best person to speak to this, but I'm not aware of any plans to change any of the SKU options in terms of where code coverage is available. In fact, some of the things we're working on now for code coverage are more to enable things like .NET Core on Linux coverage and stuff like that, where today you only have code coverage for Windows, essentially. And
all right. Thank you, Andy. Jonathan. Could you explain how Microsoft secures folks' source code if they enable IntelliCode for Teams in their DevOps environments?
Yeah, great question.
And actually, it might make sense to take a step back also, just to explain what IntelliCode for Teams is as well, for those who are not familiar with that.
Yeah, that sounds good. So for folks that don't know what IntelliCode is, it's a project that the Visual Studio team's been working on for a few years, that's aimed at leveraging AI that is trained on thousands of open source GitHub repositories and being able to use the learning from that to help make features of the IDE more prescriptive and more helpful and intelligent. And so, for example, one of the things that IntelliCode does is that as you're typing and you get a completion list, it will actually help prioritize and suggest the method or the property of the type that you're accessing that is most likely to be relevant to you based on the context of your code, so whether you're in an if statement or a while loop or whatnot, as well as an understanding of how those APIs are actually used in the wild. And so by default, when you install Visual Studio 2019, you get that kind of AI-assisted completion for all of the popular open source NuGet libraries, as well as the .NET base class library. And so to the question specifically, IntelliCode also has this capability of enabling you to choose to train a custom model on your own code base. That way that as your team is developing for that project, you'll actually get prioritized completion suggestions based on the way that your team uses your own custom types. And so the other part of the question was asking about CI. And so team completions for IntelliCode, we have support for Azure DevOps as well as GitHub Actions to allow you to basically train that model as part of CI and keep it up to date. And so from a security perspective, and we have a doc, I'll link to this in the chat, what we do is effectively generate a summary on the CI machine of just the types and their amount of occurrence and the context by which those types are used. That then gets sent to the IntelliCode service to do a basic model training on it. And then that model is then stored in the service so that it is available for anyone on the team to be able to acquire. But that model is never accessible to anybody other than folks that actually have access to that repo. We have this concept of proof of access security that ensures that. And then the lifetime of that model is also completely controlled by the team. And so if you want to delete it or update it, you can do that and there's nothing left behind. And so in summary, your code never leaves your CI machine or your developer machine when you do training. We're only effectively relying on this very minimal amount of metadata about your code and the types of your code to inform the training process. And so you know, we're continuously interested to hear feedback from folks on that. And then, as I mentioned, I'll share some deeper documentation that goes into the kind of security considerations of IntelliCode.
All right. Well, I think a nice transition from IntelliCode into IntelliTrace. Andy, maybe you can give us an Intelli answer. Are there plans to bring IntelliTrace features that are on Enterprise to Professional?
I do get all the school questions today. So again, the short answer is no. It's something that we are thinking about bringing specific aspects of it down level. And so feedback is always welcome. For example, in the past, we have brought things like some of the diagnostic tools windows, there's certain events you can see. So you can see App Insights events and some other events that are only in Pro, and there's more in Enterprise. So there's pieces of it that have gone down level, but as a whole, IntelliTrace is very much staying as a VS Enterprise only feature, you know, for customers. And again, it's a powerful tool. And it serves a certain need, especially obviously we need historical debugging, but it's not really appropriate for like smaller projects, community projects. So we're going to keep it in the enterprise SKU where it's best used.
Makes sense. Anthony, Mina is asking about Visual Studio and VS Code and any of the shared DNA that those two things may have. Can you kind of speak to what is shared and how those teams interact a little bit?
As far as DNA from a source code base, they are separate code repositories, but they actually do share a number of technologies under the covers that are quite interesting. So, for example, the underlying source code for the editor originally came from the Visual Studio editor and became a web editing component that had shipped in a number of scenarios, for example, Azure Tools, and then was brought into the Visual Studio code base itself. I believe we share some technologies around language service, language server protocols, or at least we're working on bringing some of those together with some of the work that we're doing to support and enable code spaces inside of the IDE. I'm not sure about on the diagnostics and the debugging side. Andy, do we share any technologies between those two?
Yeah, we do. So the C++ and the managed debuggers, they share components. You can think of like this core debugging component that we share across both Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and other debuggers, to be fair. But they have a different interface exposed. Visual Studio has an older interface called 87. If anyone's doing extensions, they'll be familiar with it. Whereas VS Code has the debug protocol, like a language debug adapter protocol. And in fact, for Visual Studio, we even have a wrapper where you can take any VS Code debugger and then you can package it up as a VS extension and reuse it inside Visual Studio, because we just have a little adapter layer that takes the debug adapter from VS Code and translate it to the Visual Studio interfaces. So some big parts, especially on the back end, that sit alongside the running application are shared.
There are things that are different about VS Code and Visual Studio. Their model, for example, Visual Studio Code is folder and workspace based, whereas Visual Studio, the IDE, is oriented and focuses on the solution and projects, which provide a lot of context and richness about the organization and composition of the app. So there are certainly also differences as well in those, and those don't exist in Visual Studio Code. Nick, there was a question actually I want to cherry pick and grab. I saw on the list to give us a chance to give a little bit of sneak peek of some of the features that aren't yet available, but what folks can get excited about coming to Visual Studio. It was Morin, I think, asked about Git support and Git Diff support inside of the IDE. So if you haven't tried it yet, there is a new preview feature that we've added. It's available in the main release, what we call the GA channel, as well as in our preview channel. It's some new Git tooling inside of Visual Studio. We've rewritten all of the Git experiences inside of Visual Studio. We've taken them out of Team Explorer and put them into their own dedicated Git version control tool window. We've also done a lot to bring up and make a lot of the commands and operations that you have for Git more discoverable inside of the IDE. That's available today. Folks can turn on that preview feature in 16.6 by going to Tools, Options, Preview Features, and enabling the new Git tooling there. We haven't enabled it fully for everybody yet because we're still working on getting some parity and some features that we know are really important to developers that were in Team Explorer that we're migrating out and enabling. But you can turn that on and get a sense of where we're going with the new model. We're really focused on reducing the steps it takes to do popular Git operations, as well as making functionality in Visual Studio for doing Git operations a lot simpler and easier to discover in the IDE. There was a question about Git Diff, which is actually one of those features that's pretty hard to find inside of the IDE. And once you enable that feature, you'll get a new Git top-level menu. And from that new Git top-level menu, you can see your history. There's actually a full history view. You can see all branch history inside of the IDE. You can click across any of the commits, see the commit details, and open up any of those files in the file list there to see the red line, green line diffs to show exactly what's changed and modified within a file, which was also part of the question as well. So already we're starting to make features in the IDE more discoverable that were there all along. Working through merge conflicts is another part of what's actually been in Visual Studio for a while, but it's been hard to enable. And when you did get into that workflow, that was a bit complicated. So we've made that a little bit simpler to use and consume. And then the last part is about what to expect coming down the road. So as I mentioned, we've got a bit more work to do to get this to the point that we think it's ready to turn on for everybody. We hope to be able to do that in the next update of Visual Studio. And when I say update, I mean kind of the next dot release of Visual Studio. So we just released 16.6, and we're working to try and get the last of the parity features up and running in 16.7. And one of the new features that we'll have coming online that we're working on today that I'm excited for folks to get to see is we'll have a merged Git history view where you can see all of your branches combined with a history view where you can see all the commits within that branch. So you'll get a visualization to be able to navigate all of that history together with the ability to do quick rebases and merges across branches, all within inside of the Dockwell, like you get focused experience from any other Git tools today.
Awesome. I love the way that you took the mic there, Anthony. You just took control and said, I love these Git questions. I want to make sure they're answered. I thought maybe it'd be fun to switch things up a little bit. David is asking, what upcoming feature are we most excited about? So I'll start to give everybody a moment to think, but maybe let's go around the horn. And then also, JC, Andy, if you have any pet questions that you're seeing coming through that you love, feel free to also jump in and answer those questions now or at any time. But the feature that I'm most excited about that's upcoming, I'm a little biased because I've been focusing on code spaces most recently, but we're introducing the ability to store secrets on the service, things that you need in your project, maybe a connection string or an API key that you would not put into source control. And that's just going to enable and unlock a whole bunch of different scenarios that we've been hearing from developers who have been using the service so far. So I'm particularly jazzed about that. And that kind of, for me, goes along with, this is a little bit of a cheat to David's question, but we also just released support for Docker Compose support. And so now you have the ability to create a code space that has multiple containers that have been orchestrated together and are working together. So maybe you can pull in a Mongo database or MySQL or SQL Server, whatever it is that you want to be running in that environment via a container. So that is the things that I'm excited about. Jonathan, how about you next?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm pretty excited about is a new area we're investing in with IntelliCode, which is basically detecting in real time patterns of changes that developers are making repetitively in their editing experience, right? So let's say you're kind of inadvertently following a new pattern or a new style guideline that you haven't actually codified anywhere, and so wouldn't be caught by a linter or an analyzer in VS, and therefore the team as a whole maybe isn't learning that new guideline. And so we have this thing that we're working on called IntelliCode suggestions, that as you're typing, we detect these patterns, and then we're actually going to look to make it so that those patterns can be shareable, so that as other people on the team are working on that project and they are writing code, that there's an opportunity to get a suggestion on, hey, this is how Andy had written this kind of pattern, FYI. And I'm excited about that because of the fact that you know, one thing that we've been discussing a lot as we're working remotely and as technology is changing at a faster rate than ever before, we're all learning something new all the time, no matter how long we've been developers. And so I'm excited about being able to use AI to actually help reduce the barrier for folks that are onboarding to code bases, but also learning new APIs and technologies, such that we can basically use smarter tooling to help transfer knowledge amongst the team without folks having to go explicitly document or codify those things. So that's something that, you know, I'm excited about folks keeping an eye on.
Sweet. Maybe one of the members of the Goonies can go next.
Look, I love the Goonies. Never say die. So yeah, for me personally, a bit selfishly, the tools I'm most interested or excited about are some of the performance tools we've recently been adding and plan to continue to add on. If you're familiar, or perhaps you're probably not familiar, we have a bunch of profiling tools inside Visual Studio. You get at them from Alt F2 or from the debug performance profile menu, and those tools have kind of traditionally focused on like CPU bound problems, which, you know, obviously most modern websites, most modern web applications are not so much CPU bound, but bound by the I/O, bound by network requests, databases, and things like that. So we started to add tools to expose those things. So there's a database tool that was released a version ago, and there's a new tool coming for async to show async patterns and stuff like that. So hopefully the tools can really pivot from being really good at focusing at, you know, client applications and that were CPU bound to be much more effective at helping you solve problems with I/O bound web applications, you know, distributed applications specifically. So I'm excited to start seeing those and see some of the feedback on those, and also making them work cross-platform, so they work on Linux, containers, Kubernetes, all those fun things.
And last but not least, Anthony.
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I think I think I'm going to take advantage of two mentions since I get to wrap it up. One is we talked a little about dev container JSON, and I'm particularly excited to see where we're able to take that to be able to help developers quickly onboard their dev environments. It was an area that we've gotten a lot of feedback from customers about how painful and how difficult it is to set up their dev environment. So I'm really excited about what we'll be able to accomplish there in terms of getting a code space and a dev environment set up for Visual Studio ID developers. The other one that I want to mention is a service called Rich Code Navigation. And what Rich Code Navigation is a service that will index your repository so that that index is then available for you, regardless of whether you have that project or that application open. So one of the scenarios that we think this is particularly useful for is for references or dependencies that you might have in a large organization, where you might or projects or popular open source projects that are shared by many developers. Once you've indexed that repository with Rich Code Navigation, then whenever you are consuming that project inside of your application, even if it's in a completely different repository, you'll be able to navigate, for example, go to definition or find all references for any references into that project, which we think will be pretty powerful for learning about code bases that you have a dependency on, finding references and samples. But another area where it becomes pretty powerful is for very large projects with hundreds of projects. So one of the, and we've been working for quite a while in terms of making it easier and faster for Visual Studio to load up a solution with hundreds of projects in a matter of seconds. But one of the things that we found as we've talked to developers is while some folks want to be able to load that entire project, often most of the time we're only working on a small section of a very large repository. And so we introduced a new feature called solution filters, or SLNF file. Solution filters is something that's there today, which allows you to scope down what you load into the IDE to just the projects that you're working on. But one of the challenges you face when you use solution filters is that Visual Studio is only able to understand the scope that is loaded into the IDE that it has available in scope. Well, when you combine that with the upcoming rich navigation service, now you have the ability to get search and navigation across the entire repository, even though you may only have a small segment of it loaded. So as you're starting to modify that small segment of code, you need to navigate into dependencies that you haven't loaded into the solution at that point. Rich code navigation's index can supplement that and make it possible for you to navigate across the entire repository.
And Anthony, while we've got you on the screen, folks are noticing what you're wearing in your ears, and they're asking, how do you like those Surface Buds?
Yeah, they're pretty awesome. They're quite comfortable. The touch mechanisms are pretty nice. I'll say that I'm still getting a bit used to the size of my ears. Maybe it's just because I have a small head, but no, I think that the comfort-wise they're great. The audio quality's been really good, and well, at least from my end, it's really good listening to the audio. I hope that you all agree that the audio coming through on your end from the mic is also really good.
It is. I'm seeing some questions about code spaces that I'll go ahead and take a moment to answer, and particularly browser support and Edge. So today, code spaces runs really well in Chrome and Edge. Edge, the new version of Edge that came out in the November timeframe, that's based on Chromium. So if that's the version of Edge that you're asking about, that should work great. And if you're not seeing it work great, then please do let us know, and we need to open up an issue and get that fixed. Browser compatibility is a super high priority for us. In fact, we're working with both the folks over at WebKit and Mozilla right now to make sure that our experiences in Safari and Firefox are as great as they can possibly be. And so we'll kind of continue to evolve that story. Those four are our priorities. So if the question was about the earlier versions of Edge that are not based on Chromium, we do not currently have that as a high priority item in the roadmap. Andy, there's some questions about just kind of the debugging and diagnostic schools in general around Kubernetes, and if we're doing anything to improve the story or make debugging easier for Kubernetes. Oh, and 1 point goes to Andy. Jonathan, your lead is in
I'm so happy. Thank you, Andy.
You're still ahead by one, to be fair. You're still
he's ahead by one, but you're close. I could
got
see
some
this
time.
We might have to overtime.
Yeah.
Shame. Okay, so yeah, there's a few questions I think around this topic. Instead to peel some of them off, one of them was around essentially, will we have plans to support the diagnostic tools for Linux, targeting Docker on Kubernetes, obviously. So right now, the diagnostic tools work against local targets, and on Windows, clearly, if you're targeting Linux, it's got to be remote. Even if that's WSL, that's still remote. And so it's on our roadmap to add support for remote targets. Specifically for things like Docker and WSL, so you have an ability to target things running on .NET Core, specifically running on Linux. Still figuring out if some of the other runtimes are applicable, but definitely for .NET Core. And then the second layer of that for debugging in general is we have been improving our support for targeting containers, and specifically inside the attach to process dialog. There's a connection. It's very easy to miss, but if you ever get to attach process, there's now there is a drop down at the top that says connection type, and in there's Docker. So if you have Docker running locally, you can choose that connection, that transport, and you will enumerate the list of containers that are running, and you can go ahead and choose a container, and then you can attach to .NET Core processes inside there. Straight away. So if for some reason the F5 experience isn't working, you can use that. It's also available if you use the container tools window inside Visual Studio. You can right click and attach to process. Again, F5 should hopefully be working for those Docker scenarios. And then for the Kubernetes scenarios, there is some experiences that are really as part of dev spaces. So if you haven't heard of that, it's definitely worth checking out. But that's basically the idea of developing microservices where you pull some of it locally and then other aspects, other services are essentially redirected to your Kubernetes cluster up in the cloud. Beyond that, the dev spaces plugin, and that's really where a lot of the Kubernetes functionality is. There's not much plans, but that's a ton of stuff in terms of enabling both an F5 experience and attached process experience. And then the last experience is by profiling. Today, the way you profile anything, .NET Core that's running inside Kubernetes, inside a Docker or whatever, you have to use a command line tool called .NET Trace. So if you want to search for a tool called .NET Trace, it's on the .NET Diagnostics open source repo over on GitHub, and you use a command line tool to collect the data, and then you can bring it back to Visual Studio and inspect it. So you can collect the data into a .NET Trace file or a GC core dump if you're taking one of those, and then you can bring it back to Visual Studio and inspect it and use the tools in Visual Studio to look at the data. I think that kind of answers it. There was one other question about it since I'm yapping away, and I think I'm going to answer it just to disappoint the person. I think Brendan asked about when you stop on an exception. Obviously, we show this little exception assistant, but what if I want to ignore that exception and continue? Like, say it's just a known problem, I want to ignore it. The easiest way to do that today is if you look at the bottom of that little assistant tool window, there's a checkbox that just says ignore for this DLL. And so there's no way to do it. I think you suggested on 5 seconds or something like that. There's no way to do like a time-based version of it, but you can ignore exceptions occurring in a certain DLL. And then, obviously when you press continue, those exceptions will just be ignored. And you can go back and change that to the default later if from the exceptions tool window, and there's a little icon that says like reset to defaults. Funny enough, there's features in other things, like for example in the browser, that you could hold down the F5 button, but we don't support that in Visual Studio right now. And I think there's actually a developer community suggestion for something similar. So it might be worth checking out developer community, which if you haven't, definitely if you have feature suggestions, check that out, search and upvote stuff that's already there.
Great. So given all of our experience on VS as a team, we've got many years around. There's the highly voted question. People are interested to know, have there ever been any, or what kind of Easter eggs have been hidden in any version of Visual Studio? I actually don't know of any, so I'm interested to hear if any of my colleagues know of any.
I'm not aware of any either.
I'm not either. It's certainly, that was an area that I recall. There was a time when actually there were a lot of Easter eggs across Microsoft products, but as Microsoft grew up as a company about 15 or so, 20 years ago, I remember there was a particularly deliberate push to remove Easter eggs from the product. As fun as they are when you are developing software for government agencies, major Fortune 500 companies, security and code integrity is obviously a really important critical feature of the products and the trust that you deliver to those customers. And so having Easter eggs that are undocumented functionality in the code leads to potential risks of backdoors and other exploits that are there. And so as a policy, Microsoft really doesn't allow Easter eggs in their products. And generally they shouldn't be there unless it's actually a documented feature of the product. Now, I'll say that there are a lot of hidden features of the product that I wish folks knew more about, but I wouldn't call those an Easter egg.
Yeah, the only time I've seen anything even Easter egg-y is when a PM has to build a sample app for a build session or an Ignite session or something like that. There might be little messages to their friends or to the community, maybe sometimes showing up in source code or something like that. So take a look for that. I know that's not as exciting as it landing in Visual Studio. So I have this feeling that we have some guests joining us today from Kansas City, because they keep on goading us to find out what is the best barbecue city. It's not Kansas City. And they want to know what is the best barbecue recipe, which is a trick question because the best barbecue is salt, pepper, beef, and smoke. If you're putting sauce on it, it's wrong. So clearly I'm the guy from Texas. I have my opinion. So I would say that it's Austin. Although Jonathan and I did share a pretty decent meal in Seattle a couple of months ago. We had something called the Cowboy Killer, and we could not finish it. So
Yeah, it was. I recall that it was a meal that was meant for like a party of 12, and you and I seemed to handle it just fine, whatever that says.
12 very hungry children would have been for that.
So I noticed, Nick, there's a couple of questions about live share that I was thinking about maybe quickly taking. So the first question is, are there any plans to add support for the WinForms designer for live share? And in the chat, what I did is I went ahead and added a link to the GitHub issue that's tracking this item. We don't have any specific dates or details we can share there, but it is definitely something that we've heard feedback on and would love to hear more from folks today. So, please check out that GitHub issue and reach out. The other question is from Ilya Basin, and he asks, LiveShare is currently allowing to edit the code, but does not allow the guest the ability to interact with the running application or website. And I would love to know if you've run into issues, because actually one of the, for folks that aren't aware of LiveShare, what it is it's an extension for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code that allows you to turn your editor or IDE into a fully collaborative development environment. And included in that experience is the ability to securely and remotely share the application that you're debugging with your peers. And so if you're debugging a console or a terminal application, then LiveShare allows you to share that terminal with your peers. If you're debugging a web application, in fact, in Visual Studio, by default, if you were to just hit F5 on an ASP.NET application, for example, it should be securely forwarding that server to everyone in the session so that they would be able to load it up in their browser and interact with it as if it was running locally on their machine. The third area that we've invested in, and maybe you haven't seen, is kind of what we've been calling app casting. And so if you're working on either a desktop application or a mobile application, and in order to share that with the peers, you would need to actually share the pixels of that window. We actually have support for that today in Visual Studio. You just have to enable the LiveShare Insiders channel, because that feature is not currently unstable. And so I will add a link to documentation that kind of speaks more to the debugging experience and collaboration of sharing applications with guests. And then if folks are running into problems, I'll also share a link to our GitHub issue, and we'd love to make sure we hear any feedback on how to make that better.
Great. So it looks like I was correct with my assumptions about folks being from Kansas City. Jeff is a certified Kansas City barbecue judge, so I think I answered poorly. Anthony, do we have any plans to publish Visual Studio IDE as a 64-bit application to increase its memory usage capacity? It's a highly voted for question from Anonymous. Uh-oh. And Anthony and Andy are now tied for second place.
Oh darn!
In the Mute Olympics.
Well, okay, let's see if I can stick at one. Yeah, great question. 64-bit for Visual Studio. So another one of those secrets or that folks don't know a lot about Visual Studio is actually a lot of it has already started to migrate to 64-bit. I believe Roslyn, the language service for C# is able to run in 64-bit. Parts of our debugger run in 64-bit that allow you to attach to huge applications. We've got demos showing the ability to attach and connect to Gears of War and run through and debug through that application more or less indefinitely. So we're already on the path, and as we start to, as we have been refactoring parts of Visual Studio over the last few years, but also much more motivated now for supporting code spaces, we've been looking at bringing first kind of making those components more modular, getting them out of the Visual Studio process, and moving them and making them available in 64-bit. The shell itself is not available locally in 64-bit, but one of the capabilities that we're enabling in code spaces is the ability to open large solutions without running out of memory space. So it's something that I would encourage folks to take a look at the private preview of code spaces to give that a try, because we have increased, is that 7 seconds of talk time, or So anyway, I was getting silly messages from Nick in the private video chat and stream. So anyway, no, what I was saying was the private preview for Code Spaces it has some new technology and the ability to open up extremely large solutions. I'd encourage folks to go and take a look at the sign up link that we put into the Q&A and give that a try.
No, that was me. My score for you. I think that you were a little rocky on the dismount, but you stuck the landing, so I give you a 7 on that answer.
Thank you.
So I think Andy would like to be in the hot seat for this question.
Are you sure? I don't know about that.
I think you're ready for it.
Even though I've got this fancy secret lab chair now, it's not comfortable enough for this hot seat.
I think you're Dr. Evil Lair. You're kind of playing the villain role today, so you must know how to find the evil unused classes, private methods, public methods, and project and assembly reference. How do you find all the unused stuff and eradicate it in Visual Studio?
Yeah, I feel like that was.
Was that your evil laugh? That was the worst evil laugh I've ever heard.
Laugh of like, oh god, when do I start answering that question? Because I think the short answer is that's a very difficult problem, just because of reflection. You know, obviously the ability to dynamically look at types and stuff makes it very hard for you to be certain about anything in terms of unusedness. But I'm not familiar with any specific tools for this for C#. But there must be some out there somewhere. I don't know if Anthony would have a better clue of any tools for C# that help identify essentially dead code for removal.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any specific tools to answer that question, but there is live unit testing, which is, I wouldn't say it's a solution to this problem, but I think it offers some interesting and helpful tools in the space. Where if you're not familiar with live unit testing, what it allows you to do is it actually allows you to see coverage of all your test cases and where you have test coverage running against your source code and where you're missing coverage. So when you turn that on, as you're adding new functionality, it'll give you a visual indication right in the editor to tell you what has test coverage and what doesn't. You can go back and fill in that test coverage. It also runs those tests in the background for you to indicate when you've introduced a failure for an existing test case, so you can make sure that you're fixing either the unit tests and or the code to make sure you're passing all your unit tests. All right.
That was an awesome answer.
Thank you for being the henchman there, Anthony, since Andy's villainous ways didn't land. I would have to give him a 1 if I was going to score that answer.
It's a shame.
Well, you do keep teeing him up with questions that you probably know very well he doesn't have an answer for.
I do appreciate it, Nick. I do appreciate it.
Are you saying that I'm the villain?
Yeah. You're the nice guy playing a villain in disguise, yeah.
Yes. Well, since it just came up then, are there any plans to, sorry. I'm not going to give this one to Andy because he's answered all of these types of questions. So maybe we'll put Anthony on the hot seat here. Are there plans to bring that live unit testing that you were just mentioning to Visual Studio Professional?
Oh yeah, this was a great question for Andy. I thought he was the one who was in charge of all of our product planning and defining what goes into Pro and Enterprise.
He drew the short straw this morning, and so.
Well, honestly, I can't say that I'm aware of any plans to bring that into Professional. It is quite a popular feature of VS Enterprise. We try to take a balanced approach between what we keep in the Enterprise SKU of our kind of top value add client functionality and what we bring into Pro. Over time, though, you do see that that features do make their way down into Pro. So as we're bringing in new functionality into Enterprise, so it's not to say that it's without it's impossible, but no plans that I'm aware of today.
Gotcha. How about plans for project types that are just a bunch of files? That's a highly voted question.
That's -2 points for you, Nick, for that.
I will be doing the scoring today, sir.
Why don't you take that question for us, Nick?
Any plans? Just a bunch of files project types. And I'm actually pretty sure that you can do that and have been able to do that for quite a while, actually. It's called something different. It's called a web project. And so that would work. I don't know if that gives you, because this is an anonymous person asking this question, so I don't know if that gives all of the features and capabilities that they're looking for. Of course, VS Code also works on just a bunch of files. So there are opportunities to work with it. So if you have more feedback about how you'd like to see your projects work, I also know .NET Core follows that pattern very much so as well. So if you're looking for something outside of those kind of places where it's already been surfaced in the product, please do let us know, and we can figure out what the right next steps to make there are.
Great answer, Nick. I'll add that it is possible to use the open folder feature inside of Visual Studio that allows you to basically just open up a folder very similar to what you see in Visual Studio Code, visualize everything inside of that folder, navigate all the files. It has some limited support for well-known workloads like C# and C++. It's actually how the CMake projects themselves work. So actually there's no solutions in a CMake project. You just open up the folder and there are project files inside of it. And Visual Studio is able to understand those project files for CMake and understand the structure of the apps that are there. And then I'm drawing a blank because it's 8 in the morning and we just did this about 4 hours ago, but there's also a basic technology that's in VS Code and VS for doing colorization for language syntax. If you guys remember what that's called, please save me or throw me a lifeline. But that's supported inside of Visual Studio for basic colorization for languages that aren't kind of in the box or built into VS.
That's TextMate, Jonathan was trying to say.
Yes, TextMate, exactly.
Since we're getting close to the end of time, I'm also going to kind of look to some other highly rated questions. So will VS allow us to rename projects and have the directories renamed too? That's a very specific question that has a lot of upvoted thumbs on it.
I'm guessing this probably relates to .NET full framework projects and C# projects where there's a lot of structure built into that there. I'm not aware of anything coming from the .NET team for that right now. I'd have to look up to see if there is a community item already tracking that one. The .NET Core projects are quite a bit more flexible today than they are, but there's just a difference in decoupling. You know, the folders and the projects themselves are different constructs. It's not like say just a file-based repository environment where the folders kind of become kind of logical structures of code. You know, a project file is a reference to a bunch of other source files and its dependencies and kind of what its composition and compiling are. And those can be either, you know, directly, you can keep them organized and related to a folder, or you can have many of them in a folder. So they're kind of different constructs. There might be some coding patterns that folks like to follow in terms of keeping some of these consistent, but I'm not aware of any particular features to do any kind of bulk renames or alignment between the two.
Cool. So question for the group. I'm sure everybody has found various different configurations that they prefer for this, but Ricardo is asking, what is the optimal or recommended core/thread/processor configuration that you have found that gives you the best Visual Studio performance?
Oh, and sorry.
I was going to say, I know for me, I'm running on a 4-core 16 gig Surface machine here, and I have not really had any problems doing any Visual Studio development since I've been on that machine. I'll also say that I keep VS very much up to date, as I have the opportunity to do as a Microsoft employee, as well as Windows, and so perhaps that also kind of gets worked into that puzzle there for you, Ricardo. Sorry, Andy, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to say that having a fast SSD, and plenty of RAM, I found to make the biggest impact, like especially the SSD, and especially if you're working with big projects.
Yeah, that is actually a great tip. The SSD is big time.
Perfect plug for code spaces. You can, you don't need anything locally if you're using a code space, because all of the real heavy lifting compute is in the cloud. And a little, I guess, Easter egg about the blog post we just did for Visual Studio is if you look closely at the images, there's a picture of Visual Studio running in a 2 gigabyte in a virtual machine that only has 2 gigabytes of RAM associated with it. I think it's a 3 gigahertz CPU, but only 2 gigs of RAM running locally, and it's able to run through and debug and build and run tests on that application smoothly. You'll see that in the task manager view that's there. That's only got 2 gigs of allocated RAM while it's running Visual Studio, and that's because all the heavy lifting and compute is on the 8-core 16 gig code space that I had attached to in the cloud.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, that was exactly where I was trying to lead you there. So kind of in recap, we can see JC had a score of -2 today. Andy had a score of -1. Anthony ended with -1, and I really fumbled some of these questions. I apologize to everybody. I have -6. I am the loser of today's Q&A. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with us. If you would like to continue asking questions, unfortunately, there's a bunch that we did not get to cover. Please do so by chatting to us continuously on Twitter or on dev community or GitHub, or wherever we take feedback. We'd love to kind of always interact with our customers, not just during things like this. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you.